Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us here today at the Calgary Power Platform user group. My name's Kent Weare. I'm part of the PowerCat team. So that's our customer advisory team at Microsoft, where I lead a team of solution architects focused on our emerging technologies, which includes Power Virtual Agents and Power Automate, more specifically RPA. So what I wanted to do today was to walk you through the current state of Microsoft automation and take you on a bit of a journey in terms of our tooling and how we can go ahead and solve problems using this. I do have the chat open on my other PC, so as I'm going through the presentation, do feel free to drop any questions into chat and I'll try to answer them along the way. So I'm sure you've all seen this slide many times, but I'll just quickly go through what we're going to focus on today. We will focus more so on Power Automate, and that's our cloud-based workflow automation tool. But more recently, we introduced robotic process automation capabilities, or RPA. And so that's going to be part of the core presentation today is using RPA and how it can actually fit into our holistic automation capabilities. Then we're also going to talk a little bit about Power Virtual Agents. And this is our conversational chatbot experience where we can go ahead and build chatbots without writing any code. So it aligns very well with the Power Platform in terms of our goal of democratizing who can build these solutions and how we can quickly build solutions and take them to market quite rapidly. So that's a core part of the presentation. We'll also be touching on AI Builder, some of the data connectors, and naturally the Common Data Service, which is now Microsoft Dataverse. So I do have an old slide, so I do need to update that. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about an automation journey. I'm sure you've all been there, where you end up sitting around a room and you're trying to understand what is the business process. And the reason why you're doing this is you want to automate it, but you want to ensure that you're automating the right things. If you end up automating the wrong things, all you end up doing is making a bigger mess faster. And so this is something that naturally run into a fair bit, and I'm sure you do as well. And there's this need to go ahead and to rationalize a process before you go ahead and automate it. Same thing with identifying and removing bottlenecks. The problem with this is that it typically takes a lot of effort in order to go ahead and to do so. Oftentimes it's going to involve interviewing various business stakeholders. There's probably some differences of interpretation where people are like, no, it's like this. No, it's like this. Well, I do it this way. I don't know what you're doing. And you get into a little bit of that. And naturally, you're going to come to some sort of conclusion, but oftentimes it takes a lot of work to get there. And so what if there was a way to help accelerate identifying and removing those bottlenecks and rationalizing the process? And if you could do that without needing to do a lot of manual work. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about today is a fairly new feature called Process Advisor, which is part of Power Automate, which allows us to take advantage of our RPA recording experience and capabilities in order to go ahead and help you rationalize these different business processes and identify bottlenecks. Once we have a sound business process that we're ready to automate, we can go ahead and do so using Power Automate itself. In this case, we'll also take advantage of desktop automation through Power Automate Desktop as part of another tool in our toolbox in order to go ahead and to solve that. And then lastly, what we can do is once we have the automation in place and we're generating benefit for our organization, we can now actually go ahead and enhance our end user experience. And that could be end user in the sense of internal employees, or it could be external parties such as your customers or even your partners as a way to give them a better experience. And so this just represents a journey that organizations typically take as they try to go ahead and automate their various business processes. But once they've even been able to automate, how do they go ahead and enhance those capabilities or those experiences as well for their stakeholders? So let's just talk a little bit about Process Advisor. So this is currently in public preview. This was released in, early to mid-December. And the whole goal about this is the ability to go ahead and understand and improve your processes. And how we go ahead and do this, because we want this to be an efficient process, is we use recorders. Now, in this case, we're actually using Power Automate Desktop underneath the hood, and the recorders that are provided as part of that experience, where we can go ahead and get an end user who knows the business process to go ahead and record their script. So record them going ahead and populating the various applications with data that they would normally perform as part of their overall process. Now, one of the outcomes or the outputs of doing this is these process maps. And so here's an example of a process map that allows us to go ahead and detect the variants, not the COVID variants, but the variants of process that exist and how frequent those variants are actually go ahead and used. And so this will allow you to help standardize on what is sort of the happy path. Do you have exception paths? Are the people not following the correct path? How do we course correct that? And so that's the whole goal of this process map that'll get generated. And then naturally the ability to go ahead and have some additional in-depth analytics as well. And so this is really in the form of time analysis. And I'll show you that in the demo itself. So typically, how does this process work? So number one, you go ahead and create a process inside of Power Automate. It's kind of like, think of it like you're creating a project. And this is where you'll go ahead and be able to record your process. So you'll hit record, and then you'll open up the various applications that you use, provide your different inputs of data, save your transactions, close your application, and all of those steps go ahead and get recorded. Now, the next step is you're going to go ahead and annotate or edit those recordings. So naturally, when you're recording your business process, you might be typing in like a username and password. That's not something that's relevant to the overall process. So you can go ahead and essentially scrub that or remove that data. Now, you might also run into situations where you might be, entering customer information as part of that script, and you don't want that to persist inside of essentially the tables underneath the hood. So you can go ahead and scrub customer information as well. And also, we do take screenshots as part of that recording experience. You can go ahead and remove those as well. Now, once you've gone ahead and recorded and annotated or edited a process, you can also go ahead and share this experience with other colleagues, so they can go ahead and also record their experiences and contribute them to this, essentially this process project, where you can subsequently go and run analysis on top of all of that data, which will then go ahead and generate the analytics that we're interested in. So this is kind of just a summary of the experience itself. You will find the processes show up here in the left nav of Power Automate itself. And this is something that is enabled for everyone. When you go to try to use this, naturally it'll prompt you to install Power Automate Desktop if you don't already have it installed. So I'll take you through a live demo so we won't worry too much about this particular slide. This is that experience where we have the ability to go ahead and to annotate or edit basically our recordings itself. And so we can go ahead and also group related tasks. I would consider them almost like sub-processes, which will help us also with those bottlenecks. So we'll be able to say, like, for these particular steps, this is mapped to a sub-process. We know it's taking this long within this sub-process to go ahead and to execute. Once again, I'll show you this in a live demo, so won't spend too much time on it here. As you can see, fairly intuitive user interface. It's part of the Power Automate Maker Portal experience, so you can go ahead and perform gestures like sharing and collaborating your project. It's also solution aware, which means that you can also export your solution and move it into subsequent environments or share it with other people in your organization as well. Now, the other, the process maps are obviously sort of a key part of all of the solution. This is a Power BI embedded experience. So at this point, you won't be able to modify it, but it is something that will be available to you inside of the Power Automate portal itself. So let's go ahead and let's just show a demo of this. Now, I'm in the Power Automate portal itself. I'm on the left nav, we've got processes. And as part of processes, I can go ahead and find an existing process that has already been created. Now, in this case, it's just going to be called Contoso Invoice Processing. We can see all of the various recordings that have taken place previously, and now we have the ability to add a new recording. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on the new recording button. Here, it's going to prompt me to open up the recorder. Since I have Power Automate Desktop already installed, naturally I'm going to be able to take advantage of that tool. So this is the recorder that's just loading right now. What I'm going to do is just minimize my screen here. And I'm going to go ahead and open up my invoicing application. So the scenario that we're dealing with right now is we've got essentially a contractor who's been working on a specific project. They want to be able to submit their invoice to our organization. Ideally, we want to have some sort of approval over that invoice being submitted. And so what we're going to do right now is essentially record what this manual process would typically go ahead and entail. We'll then subsequently run it through all of the analytics, find out the variations that do exist, and then we'll be able to standardize on a specific business process that we do want to automate end to end. So to use this recorder, I just go ahead and click on Start Recording. And then what you'll see is when I'm in my application, anywhere where you see a red box, that's essentially a UI element that has been detected as part of the Power Automate desktop recorder itself. Now, as part of this process, the first thing I need to do is I need to go ahead and click on Invoices. Then I need to go ahead and click on New. What you'll notice here on the left-hand side is that these steps are being recorded as I'm clicking, within the application itself. So here I'm just going to go ahead and add the account, and this account will just be Litware. I'll click into Contact, and I'll provide a contact information. And then I'll go ahead and provide an amount. And then I can go ahead and indicate that this has now been invoiced. I'll then go ahead, click on Save, and I can finish up my recording. I can also go ahead, I could have closed the app as part of that recording as well. Now, so what's going to happen is if I head back to the Power Automate Maker portal, we can see that we've got a new recording that has been added to our recording list. At this point, I need to go ahead and just annotate this and edit it. So this will just take just a moment to show up here. Okay, so that has been updated. These are all of the steps that were previously recorded. So the first thing I probably want to do is go ahead and remove any PII information. So here I can just go ahead and say this was an email address because it doesn't actually have an impact on my recording itself. If I wanted to go ahead and remove the account, I can go ahead and do so as well. Now, the other thing that I need to do is basically break this down, this larger process, into sub-processes, and I can do that through the use of activities. So what I can do is go ahead here and create an activity, and I do have some pre-populated because this is an existing project, but I can go ahead and say this is related to open invoicing app, and then I can create another activity, another couple activities. And here what we're going to go ahead and do is now that we have it open, we're going to go ahead and we will go ahead and say we want to create a new invoice, and then say down here, and I'm just kind of arbitrarily doing this, we're going to say that this is related to saving an invoice down below. So we would go ahead and annotate this, essentially create our different buckets, which then allows us to help identify bottlenecks. At this point, we could go ahead and flip this bit indicating that it's ready to analyze and save it itself. Now, just in the interest of time, it will take a couple minutes for that analysis to take place, but the outputs or the outcome of that is essentially going to be our analytics. So I'm just going to get this loaded up in a couple screens. The first one that we're going to go ahead and see is that process map, and then what we'll see is some time analysis as well. And so as part of the process map, this is where we're going to see all of those different variants that do exist. And we can see that the other people that have participated and submitted their recordings, their data will be captured in here as well. And so this will allow us to identify, do we have a common business process? Is there a lot of variations to the process? And we'll be able to get some insights into why that is the case. It could be for a good reason. Maybe you've got different exception processes or different thresholds. But in general, you want to be able to detect that. And if you can use that through the use of screen recording as opposed to everyone sitting around that conference table and doing a whole bunch of interviews, this will allow you to get more predictable information itself. So this is that process map. As you can see, everyone starts off by opening up the invoicing app, but then we start to see some variations. Some people are receiving invoices from an email attachment. Some people are getting invoices off of a network drive. Then we see people going ahead and creating new invoices. They'll fill out the forms, they'll save it. And we can also see the variance in how popular they are. So in this case, we've got 3 people that are going to open up the email versus 1. And if we wanted to go ahead and see which is the most popular path, we can go ahead and click on these variants by frequency. Since it's a Power BI embedded experience, what we're going to do is essentially be able to filter, slice and dice all of this related information and see what that happy path essentially is. Now, I'll just wait for that to load. And while let's take a look at the other analytics. That didn't show up quite as I wanted it to. The other analytics is really just going to break everything down by time. So we'll be able to see how long each recording took, what was the mean, what was the median time for all of these various steps to take place. And then because we do have the ability to filter based on who submitted the recording, we can also see if people who's sort of taking the longest. Now, in this case, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It could be that they're actually following the process correctly, as opposed to someone who could be taking shortcuts and aren't, following the process end to end. But once again, this is calculated automatically for you because we've had the scripting basically being recorded itself. Okay, so are there any limitations on what kind of programs can be recorded? It looked like it was either WPF or Windows Form, .NET application. So this is a good question from Jared. So what I would say is there's generally pretty good support for a wide variety of different applications. And so this comes back to our acquisition of Softomotive. So that happened last spring, where we acquired an existing RPA player who had like 10 plus years in the RPA space as well. In the past, last year at this time, within our offering, we really could only go ahead and automate those basically Windows applications, or we were dependent upon Selenium to go ahead and automate web. With the introduction of Softomotive, we certainly have better support for web, better support for Java. We continue to have support for Windows, and it's something that we're continuing to invest in. We do have some support for Java already, but there's a big release. Don't tell anybody, but in April, the next release, we're going to see some expanded support for Java. So on top of that, we also do have support for some some terminal applications as well, like green screens. And then we also do have strategies around computer vision as well. And I would call that probably more of a fallback strategy, but you can also take advantage of computer vision to detect specific buttons or fields on essentially some sort of UI as a fallback strategy if we can't actually read the underlying accessibility tags that are typically how RPA is used. So that gives you some insight in terms of Process Advisor and sort of what are some of the things that we can do as part of recording and trying to consolidate, aggregate all of these various recordings to then find a common business process that we want to go ahead and automate from that perspective. So let's just jump back into the slides here. So at this point, we know what is the business process. We know the path that we want to go ahead and automate. And this is where we can go ahead and take advantage of Power Automate in order to go ahead and automate that business process. Now, I talked a little bit about this in the intro, but when it comes to Power Automate, we really look at it as a holistic automation tool. Now, a big part of our platform is the connectors, right? So we've had connectors back to the Microsoft Flow days in 2016. So this is a very sort of mature motion for us at Microsoft. Today we have over 400 connectors that do exist. On top of that, you can always create custom connectors, and you can go ahead and automate across cloud-based services or even on-premise services as well. So that continues to be a big part of our overall offering. Naturally, we're going to provide you good experiences around Office 365 and Teams automations as well through the use of these connectors. Definitely a very sort of strong offering that we have versus our competitors. On top of that, we also have support for other third-party systems, whether that be Salesforce or SAP. And then naturally, we also have support for Dynamics 365 when we talk about line of business applications as well. Now, something that we can also take advantage of, and we're going to see this in the demo itself, is how we can also take advantage of AI Builder and the power of AI. And so much like we've talked about chatbots and RPA, and we saw Power BI previously, and we've got Power Apps, the whole goal of this platform is to democratize who can go ahead and build solutions, and that also includes artificial intelligence as well. And so something that we can take advantage of is form processing capabilities is probably the most popular feature inside of AI Builder, where we can go ahead and scrape documents and extract details from that document through the use of a connector. Once we have that information, we can go ahead and use it in approvals. We can use it to go ahead and drive legacy applications. So in the previous demo with Process Advisor, I was manually typing information into that legacy invoicing application. But if I have the data, I can go ahead and drive that GUI, that application, and pass in these details that are scraped from a PDF itself. And so naturally that becomes a very compelling part of our overall solution and the value prop itself, because you're not required to therefore then copy and paste that information, which is what so many people have to do these days when they get documents in, like an invoice. They're going to copy and paste, and we're really trying to avoid that mundane and tedious work that is oftentimes error prone. Now, this is actually a pretty important slide in the overall sort of strategy that we do have. Power Automate really allows us to deal with both ends of the automation spectrum. So on one hand, we have modern systems with APIs, and this allows us to go ahead and connect to Salesforce and ServiceNow and Microsoft Teams and your email box and SharePoint and all of these other SaaS applications. And we can do this quickly, and the connectors are easy to use, and you just have to put in your username and password, and a lot of it is very intuitive from there. But naturally, and this is where RPA really comes in, is that not every application is going to have an API. Or if they do have APIs, you may not have access to them. So oftentimes this will occur just the vintage of the application itself. So you might have just an old application. It could be a web app running on your intranet. It could be a traditional looking app like I showed you in the demo. Or it even could be SAP, where there are APIs, but the basis team isn't going to unlock that door for you. And so what you're left to do is you need to go ahead and automate, through the front door, so through the user interface itself, as opposed to the back end. Now, in terms of Microsoft and our strategy, we will promote the use of APIs. If you can use an API, if you can use a connector, you should use it. It will be more reliable. It will be more performant. And that's just not a knock against our RPA offering. That's all RPA offerings. Anytime you deal with RPA, there's always going to be some environmental constraints. It could be the resolution of the screen. It could be where it's hosted. Is it in Citrix? Is it in Azure? Is it on-prem? There's a lot of things that you have to think about from an RPA perspective that you don't have to think about when you're dealing with APIs. And really, this is what sets us apart compared to a lot of our competitors, is that we're able to handle both ends of the spectrum. And it's been super interesting. ServiceNow just announced an acquisition, I guess it was earlier today or maybe it was yesterday, around how they've now acquired an RPA player in order to sort of bolster their offering. Now, on the flip side, UiPath, which is a very strong competitor in the RPA space, guess what they did? They went ahead and acquired essentially a DPA, digital process automation tool, that's based on APIs to help shore up their offering. So while we're probably one of the earlier market participants to sort of use this sort of strategy, we're now starting to see other organizations, other competitors follow suit, which is quite interesting to watch. Now, when it comes to RPA, like what does that process typically look like? Well, we've already seen some of it because we were using that same recorder that we saw in the Process Advisor demo. Now, as part of that process, we can record tasks. So we can record the input of information. And then the idea is we can save that recording. And instead of having that hard-coded text, we can use essentially input parameters or variables that allow us to have this sort of generic RPA script that when we provide inputs into it, those values essentially get substituted for those hard-coded values that we used when we recorded that specific scenario. And so this allows us to go ahead and play back the task over and over again while having some dynamic inputs from that perspective. So let's talk just a little bit about Power Automate Desktop. So much like Power BI has a desktop offering and the cloud-based service, there's some similarities between what we're trying to do and what they're doing itself. When it comes to desktop automation and the ability to record, you do need some sort of like thick client application that allows you to do that. And so that is what Power Automate Desktop is. It is not a full replacement for Power Automate, the online service. More so, it's there to handle those desktop automation needs. And so we do have an authoring experience where you can use these recorders, and you can also use these actions, which are essentially like pre-built functionality or kind of like functions that you can use as part of your automation. So that could be like opening a file, saving a file, copying a file, things like that. Naturally, as you would expect, we do have support for error handling. And then what we can do, and this is where our hybrid approach really shines, is that all of your desktop automations get saved up to the cloud, and then you can go ahead and call them using a connector. And so this allows you to create like a mashup or that hybrid where if you need to go ahead and contact an email box, you can do that using a connector. And you can extract details and then push those details down to the desktop through parameters, input parameters, and then you can receive the results using output parameters. And that really allows you to sort of have these hybrid architectures that takes advantage of the cloud and also gives you a good desktop experience as well. Now, what are the capabilities? I touched on a little bit of this as a result of the question that came in, but these are the different sort of support we have for desktop applications. Some of this is related to the acquisition of Softomotive. And then we also have support for additional browsers. Once again, capabilities that were provided through the Softomotive acquisition. And then we've got a unified tool for both web and desktop recording. As I mentioned before, we used to have two sort of tools to do that. One was Selenium, one was our own. Now there's really those capabilities found in a single application itself. So this is it's not the greatest image, but this is an image of our design surface. On the left-hand side, we have all of the actions. And then you go ahead and configure all of the various steps that are part of your process. You've got things that you would expect in sort of a tool like this, like adding loops, have conditions, you have variables, input, outputs, data, and then also there's built-in computer vision, as I mentioned before, where you can go ahead and detect specific images. I have a recent video on my YouTube where I use this when I'm trying to buy a barbecue that's currently sold out. And that's also a walkthrough that sort of will demonstrate that capabilities of that technology itself. Now, what's also interesting about Power Automate Desktop is its support for scripting languages. And so that's where we see here, we've got the ability to integrate VB-script, Python, JavaScript, and PowerShell into your automation. And so especially for IT admins, this gives you an opportunity to go ahead and have an orchestration engine around PowerShell. So naturally, people living in this M365 world, there's lots of great tools and APIs that you can connect to, provision access, add people to groups, add people to teams. But naturally, there's going to be some of those constraints where you still need to do things on-prem. And maybe you need to add people to a local on-prem Active Directory instance. Well, you can go ahead and use your PowerShell as part of that, and you can now orchestrate that across the board. Also on my YouTube channel, I talk about automating the installation of gateways, and that might be another scenario where you want to orchestrate going ahead and deploying gateways, and you want to be able to do that from a centralized location, but by using PowerShell here, it gives you more visibility from that perspective. Naturally, you would expect error handling to be quite important when we talk about RPA automation. And what we've done here is we've integrated the local logging that had traditionally existed in Softomotive and pushed that all up to the cloud. Oftentimes you'll see with other RPA providers, they'll have like a local debug file, and then you need to log on to that machine in order to basically go through the logs. Well, here we suck all of that up to the cloud, and then we link it back to your Cloudflow, that so you can essentially follow the breadcrumbs and see all of your inputs, all of your outputs, how long each step took, and it really takes the guesswork out of like where you might have bottlenecks, because you can clearly see that through our tooling. And I touched on this a little bit before, but once I've gone ahead and built out my desktop automation and I save it, it then becomes discoverable as part of my Cloudflow experience. So these desktop flows are solution aware. They are also environment aware. And so when I'm in the same environment, what I can do is drop this run a flow built by Power Automate desktop connector into my Cloudflow. It knows who I am, and it'll then be able to iterate a list of all of the desktop flows that I have access to. And then I can choose what is the mode that I want to run. Is it attended or unattended? And when I select this specific flow, any of the inputs that are required for this desktop flow will show up. And then I can use any of my dynamic content from previous steps in order to drive that specific automation itself. So it becomes quite powerful, also quite intuitive in terms of how you go ahead and build out all of those scenarios. Now, back to our journey and our business process is, so we're now at the point where we can automate this business process. We've got a contractor that's finished a project. They're going to go ahead and submit their invoice. This is going to be a PDF. We want our bot to be able to go ahead and monitor an inbox, extract the attachment, and send that attachment over to AI Builder. AI Builder will be able to extract those specific details from the invoice that we basically instruct it to provide. And then what we'll do is we will pass that off to the project owner for them to go ahead and to approve that specific request. Provided they've approved that request, we'll go ahead and drive that desktop application and essentially go ahead and use RPA to go ahead and populate that invoice. Then what we'll do is we'll close the loop and be able to send an email back to that contractor indicating that their invoice has been submitted. So let's go ahead and let's submit an invoice. So that's been sent in. Now let's just take a closer look at the invoice itself. The invoice itself is going to have some information that's going to be pertinent for our approver. So things like who is it billed to, what is the contact information, what is the total amount due, what is the invoice number, and the related dates itself. And so what's going to happen is when we go ahead and receive this specific invoice, we're going to go ahead and retrieve the attachment from the inbox itself. And so that's something that we can easily configure here. And this is one of the benefits of using our connectors as opposed to trying to record this, like you might see in some other traditional RPA tools. We'll go ahead and we'll look for any emails that have a specific filter, that have attachments, and then we'll go ahead and basically detach that attachment and send it into our AI Builder model. So what we can do is take sample documents, essentially that invoice that I showed you, and we can go ahead and train an AI Builder model, instructing it to say, these are the fields that we're interested in. And so what will happen is when we pass that attachment in, AI Builder will essentially return us data that we can go ahead and use inside of other downstream connectors. So the account value, the contact value, and the amount value. Now, all of this JSON is part of an adaptive card. which you'll see here shortly when I flip over to Teams. That just really gives us some very rich markup. Now what's going to happen is when I go ahead and approve, I'm going to go ahead and then call that desktop automation itself. I'm going to pass those values in. And what we'll be able to do is use those values to drive that GUI that I previously showed you. Now, I'll get to this update row, this audit. I've got a couple audit points along the way that we'll use when it comes down to the chatbot. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then what we'll do is once we've processed that invoice, indicate that it has been approved and email back the original requester itself. So if I flip over to Teams, I now have an approval that is waiting for me, and I can go ahead and click approve and then confirm. And at this point, what's going to happen now is we'll see the RPA process spin up here in a few moments, and it'll basically go ahead and drive that GUI that I showed you previously. So there we go. It's now running, and that has completed. Now we give it just a few minutes. What we will see is an email will be sent back indicating that the invoice has been approved. And basically we've essentially closed the loop. So here we can see that that email has now been sent back to our requester. Now, in terms of our process, like what did this look like? So let's just go ahead and open up Power Automate Desktop. So once again, it is environment aware. So this is my dev environment, same user that I'm logged in. And then what we'll do is process invoice is the name of my script. Now, in terms of how I built this, it was very similar to what I had done previously with Process Advisor. Here, what I would have done is clicked on Desktop Recorder. I'm going to launch a specific application, and then it's going to record me going through and typing all of those values in, the account, the contact, and the amount. Now, what I've done here, though, is I've created input variables, account, amount, contact, and then I've replaced the hard-coded tokens with these input variables. And then naturally, I can also go ahead and have output variables as well. So I can return the invoice ID back out as well. And that represents all of these recorded steps. Now, not everything does have to be recorded, especially when it comes to Excel. We've got some pretty good support for Excel. So we can go ahead and do things like open up an Excel spreadsheet, find the first free row, insert data, run a macro, copy cells from one worksheet to another worksheet. These are all capabilities that can't actually be done using our connector out of the box. And so we've got some rich support here. On top of that, we also have things like files, the ability to manipulate files, wait for files, check for files, zip, unzip. The PDF stuff is pretty interesting. So there's a lot of capabilities here. It's more than just recording. It's basically also these actions. And the best part of it is we can use a combination of both, where we can use these actions, we can use recordings, and really find the optimal solution in order to drive our automation. Okay, so let's jump back. The other thing that's just worth mentioning is you can also do a lot of your local debugging here. So typically what you would do is you would go in, you would record, you would run, you can set breakpoints, do your troubleshooting, establish your inputs, outputs. Once you've done that part of the script, then you go into your Cloudflow, build your Cloudflow around it. And that's typically how you would go ahead and build out these automations. So let's switch gears here and let's talk about the optimization. So at this point, it's great. We've been able to automate our workloads. We've been able to make our employees more efficient. So they're not doing a lot of this mundane manual work. Now, what about that partner though? Like, what about the consultant or the contractor that submitted their invoice and they're wondering what is the status of that invoice itself? Now, obviously in the demo, everything happened quite quickly. naturally that may not always be the case. So what if we gave them a chatbot experience where they could go ahead and learn about our payment terms, or even go ahead and check on the status of their invoice to see if it's been approved or not? What if we could go ahead and layer on a conversational chatbot experience on top of that process that we've just automated? So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about now in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about, self-service and chatbots and why this is important. Now, just here's essentially some industry information just around, complex challenges when it comes to customer service. Now, 66% of people would prefer to use self-service rather than contacting an agent for assistance. I think we've all been there, whether it's, it's talking to various utilities or other service providers. It's not always fun, sitting on hold. And if you can go ahead and solve your problem through a chatbot experience, I'd be willing to bet you would do that if it was a good experience itself. Now, a next thing that's oftentimes very frustrating as well is, if you've ever, say, used a chatbot and then maybe you've had to call back and talk to an agent and you're getting different information, or your information isn't actually tied together because you've got silos across your various channels, that becomes a very frustrating experience. Whether you're talking to a chatbot or whether you're talking to someone over the phone, you would expect that you're getting access to the same information as well. And then the other challenge is that these channels can often be managed in silos, and that just leads to a poor customer experience. So that's the goal of our chatbots, is how we can provide self-service capabilities. And oftentimes it starts with providing Q&A bots, question and answer bots, frequently asked questions, being able to provide people a self-service experience around that. But it becomes even more valuable when you can go ahead and transact on behalf of that user itself, and to use automation in order to go ahead and look up data or create data on behalf of that specific user. Now, in terms of the architecture of Power Virtual Agents, this is a service that's really built on the shoulders of giants. So it starts with Azure Cognitive Services and a lot of the investments that Microsoft has made in AI through our Microsoft research arm. We're also taking advantage of the bot framework and all of their messaging channels that do exist. So it's not something where we've reinvented the wheel from that perspective. Now, bot framework is great, but it does require you to write code. It is fairly sophisticated, and it isn't meant for subject matter experts who may be well versed in the content that customers want to use to go ahead and build out those chatbots. Now, the goal with Power Platform is to democratize that, and how can we bring more people to the party to build out these chatbots? And so what we've done is built abstractions on top of the bot framework itself. And so this is where that Power Platform layer comes into place. We're able to take advantage of some shared concepts, some shared assets, such as Microsoft Dataverse, our solutions, and then also our ability to leverage the connectors found in Power Automate. One of our core extensibility stories is the ability to plug in a Power Automate flow into our chatbot so that we can go ahead and talk to various systems like Microsoft Dataverse. And so what is fundamentally different between our platform and say the Azure Bot Framework is that in the past, you might have, say, a business unit that has requirements and you throw them over the wall, and then IT or developers will go ahead and build this. And it is something where there's constant back and forth from that perspective. And what ultimately happens is that you've got a small group of experts that can go ahead and build out these bots. Now, what we're seeing more of when it comes to Power Virtual Agents is more of this hybrid approach, where we do have developers building out more of the technical capabilities of the solution. And that could be, building a custom connector, building more advanced flows, even plugging it into the bot framework. Those are tasks typically performed by your developers. But when it comes to the content and what is the language that customers usually use, that's best left up to the subject matter experts. And using Power Virtual Agents allows both of those parties to go ahead and contribute. It's something we call essentially a fusion dev team. And what this allows you to do is take your bots to market much faster than traditional models itself. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this in a whole lot of detail, but one thing that's really important to think about when it comes to a bot is that it doesn't have basically a life cycle like a typical project where there's a start date and an end date. When it comes to bots and using artificial intelligence, you want to be able to capture signals from your users in order to make improvements in the bots itself. Because the whole goal of a bot is for it to interpret what is it that the user is requesting it to do, and then being able to respond or route that request accordingly. And so this is something where you will learn from your customers, and that's why we provide analytics. And then what you want to do is tweak your experiences and be able to go ahead and leverage those learnings in order to improve the quality of your bot. So let's go ahead and just see the last bit of our journey here, where we're going to go ahead and improve on the experience for our contractor, where they can go ahead and check out the status of their invoice. Now, in the flow that I just showed you before, I did have essentially some log points. And these log points occur before we go ahead and route for approval. We'll go ahead and create a new record in an invoice table inside of Dataverse, which is basically going to record the fact that we've got a specific invoice from a specific vendor that we want to go ahead and capture. And then naturally, we're going to let the process run its course, and we'll then go ahead and we'll update that audit record once it's gone ahead and been approved. And so we can go ahead and do that, if it was successful or if it failed itself. So that's going to be just part of our overall process itself. So we can go ahead and just kick that off. We'll go ahead and send another invoice in. And so we'll let that run. And then in the meantime, I'm going to head over to Power Virtual Agents. So this is the Maker portal. And what we have here is a series of topics. You can think of a topic as essentially a conversation and really a conversation workflow. A workflow that basically is how you would model a conversation. We've got a combination of user-created topics, so these would be custom topics you create, plus we've got system topics that Microsoft provides out of the box that allows you to go ahead and basically address common scenarios like greetings, goodbyes, etc. I just realized I was in the wrong bot, so I'm just flipping over to a different bot. Just give it a moment here. So now, naturally, what we typically do is part of a greeting, we want to collect some information about who we're actually conversing with. And so in this case, we're going to ask them for additional information. We'll ask for an email address, and we're also going to ask them for their partner ID. And what's interesting about these responses is they get stored in variables. And in this case, we're going to store them inside of essentially a global variable, which allows us to reuse this information in other topics. So if we have someone that's already provided their partner ID, down the road, if we need to use that partner ID, we don't want to have to reprompt them again. And by using this bot scope variable allows us to go ahead and to do so. Then what we're going to do in this case is just validate the partner itself based upon the information that they've provided. So what we'll do is we're just going to kick off this greeting, and I'm just going to go ahead and say, hi. And that will go ahead and fire this specific topic. And at this point, I need to provide an email address. So I'm going to go ahead and provide the email address that was included in that invoice. And now I need to provide a partner ID. And there we go, that's now provided. And so at this point, I'm essentially been, I would call it authenticated. And at this point, it knows who I am because I've provided that information and it's validated. Now, what I've been able to do here is leverage some integration or extensibility that we do have with Bot Framework Composer. So here I'm using essentially some adaptive cards to go ahead and provide a richer experience. Now, I've submitted my invoice. I'm curious to know what are the terms of this specific invoice. So now I'm going to get launched into another topic. and I'm going to be asked a question. Okay, basically, how much is my invoice for? Is it under 50K or more than 50K? So in this case, it is under 50K. And I can see that the invoice amounts are subject to net 30 days. Okay, so that's great. That answers my question. Now what I want to go ahead and do is I want to get my payment status. So now I can go ahead and type payment status. And in this case, what's going to happen is I need to now provide my invoice ID, and we've now switched over to another topic. And so here I can provide the invoice of 1012. And this will call another flow. So this is going to go ahead and use that extensibility that we do have in Power Automate that allows it to go ahead and do a lookup inside of Microsoft Dataverse, and we can see that my invoice is pending approval. And it's pending approval because I haven't gone ahead and approved that invoice. So let's go ahead and let's just click on that approval. And what we'll see now is that our RPA process will go ahead once again, and it'll complete. Okay, so that process is now done. And so this will just take a few seconds to update, but let me just quickly show you this flow while that's happening. As part of our Better Together story, we do have connectors for Power Virtual Agents. Here we can see these are the inputs that are required. And then what we'll go ahead and do is we'll essentially do an OData query against that specific record inside of Microsoft Dataverse. And then we can go ahead and essentially provide the invoice status. And so if we head back over to our chatbot, let's just run this again. Once again, the same invoice number. We should now see that it has been approved because as part of our audit log, when we processed that RPA, we naturally went ahead and updated that record. So that concludes essentially our journey of automation with inside of the Microsoft platform itself. And so it started off with rationalizing our business process, making sure that we had a sound process to go ahead and automate, and we were doing the right things. We were able to then go ahead and subsequently automate it through the combination of cloud flows plus desktop flows. And then lastly, we went ahead and we went and enhanced that specific process through the use of Power Virtual Agents. And we're able to do all of this in a low-code, no-code manner, and can actually build out this solution quite quickly because of all of these various building blocks, and also deal with a variety of different vintages of applications, whether it's cloud-based modern AI or our legacy invoicing application as well. So with that said, I will leave you with some additional resources. In terms of the RPA stuff that I showed you here, that is part of our RPA in a day package. So that's something where you can, if that was an interesting demo for you, you can go ahead and find it here at this specific link. Download the package, doesn't cost you anything. You can sign up for a free trial with Power Automate Desktop and essentially learn all of this, exactly what I showed you here today. Also, similarly, we do have Power Virtual Agents in a day. It's going to teach you some of the concepts that I showed you today. So it's a nice learning resource as well. You can get through both of them within a day. And then I also wanted to call out some additional resources here as well. The team that I'm part of, PowerCat, we do have a regular YouTube series called Automate It, where we do talk about enterprise automation, primarily targeted at robotic process automation. And then we have a similar motion for chatbots, and we call it Build a Bot. And then lastly, some information about myself. If you're not following me on Twitter, you can find me at Wearzy, and then I also do have a YouTube channel. I post weekly there, generally around Power Automate and Power Virtual Agents. So that can...